Hope you are ready to learn a little bit about the white wines of Germany. As I say, this is in partnership with Wines of Germany, who've been very helpful in getting us some lovely images and maps that we will be sharing with you in a little while. But let me start off with a little bit of introductory info about Germany and their winemaking. So Germany is one of the most northerly wine growing countries in the world, and they have a very long growing season and warm days with cool nights in autumn, which make a very good sort of growing climate for good concentration in flavour and aromas. They're home to nearly 135 different grape varieties. However, we've only got the hour, so we will be just focusing on 3 varieties and 2 in different ways, and the different regions we'll be focusing on are just 4 of the more pertinent white wine growing regions. If you have all the wines that we suggested, or you have examples of the wines that we've suggested, to give you a heads up, we will be looking at dry Riesling first, then Weissburgunder, then Grauburgunder, and then sweet Riesling. So if you need to get any out of the fridge or get any opened, please do, but we'll give you a reminder as to each time we'll be talking about that wine variety. This isn't going to have a particular guided element in terms of the tasting, so do feel free to taste throughout at your leisure as well. I think we should have a map of Germany that we'll be able to bring up for you, and do let us know in the chat if you have any issues seeing any of the slides that we're showing this evening, but hopefully you'll be able to see that very shortly. Now you'll see the main regions are highlighted, and they're mainly down in the southwest of the country, but you do have Sachsen and Saarlandstrut in the eastern, more middle east area of the country, but we'll be looking down in the southwest. We're going to be looking at the Rheingau, Mosel, Pfalz and Baden this evening. The vineyards are often planted on steep hills and slopes, often topped with protective forests or near light reflecting rivers like the Rhine or Mosel. And the wines produced come in all 3 colours, white, red and rosé, and sparkling wines. We're looking at 3 white varieties, but some of the reds you might be familiar with include Spätburgunder, Dornfelder and Blaufränkisch. And you might also be familiar with Sekt as the sparkling wine from Germany. And German wines are very popular in their home market, which may be why you're not as familiar with them over here, or it may be that you have perhaps not necessarily bad memories, but memories of wines like Blue Nun and Black Tower that perhaps you maybe want to forget or move on from. But over the last few years, there has been a significant increase in sales, and particularly in premium German wines in the UK market, as people are falling back in love with them. 66.9% of Germany's vineyards are dedicated to producing knockout white wines, and they also produce 70% of the world's Riesling. They are the largest producer of Pinot Blanc, which in Germany is known as Weissburgunder, and the 3rd largest producer of Pinot Gris, known as Grauburgunder. So it seems only right in a tasting and event about Germany that we kick off with Riesling. And I think we can say that of all the grapes in Germany, perhaps the most noble is Riesling. It's a variety that can do very well even in stony soil and can subsist on very little moisture. It's also very frost resistant and very dependable bearer of high quality grapes. They have a really good acidity level that gives the wine a racy freshness and really contributes to its long life. The grapes are quite small and the bunches are compact, and it is susceptible to noble rot, which is a great way of making sweeter botrytized wines. It's also a variety that is renowned to express its terroir, so whereabouts in Germany it is grown or the wine is produced from really does have an influence on the style of wine that you will get. So we've got a lovely image of some Riesling grapes there for you now. So to reach its full potential, it does need quite a few extra days of sun. The ripening is usually very late, not until the latter half of October. And the wines that it produces are quite rich in character, with incomparable fragrance and taste. And it's got a real good aging ability as well. So it's quite a do everything grape. It can do a lot of things from the one thing. And I think that's what people are most likely to be familiar with in terms of German white wines is Riesling, whether that's the sweet wines that you're familiar with or drier wines. But if you do have a dry Riesling, now is probably a good time to take a sip, see what you think. The one I have this evening is the Hockheimer Höhle im Neuenberg Riesling Künstler 2009. The grapes for this wine are hand harvested and destalked before the musts are cooled, and they're put into stainless steel where they undergo a cool and slow fermentation. When that's complete, they're racked and then they're left on their fine lees to gain a bit of texture as well as flavour. You might also have the Österreich Riesling, which was the other one that we see Anna's nodding there. That's the other one that we suggested as a dry Riesling to consider. This is from a family-run estate, and they have around 11 hectares of vines on various soils, and they are overlooking the Rhine in the crook of the Rheingau elbow. So if we now move on to the Rheingau, I think we can get a lovely map up for you. So the reason we've chosen those two Rieslings is they are both from the Rheingau. So it works out nicely that each wine we've chosen to talk about will also have a corresponding region. So they're going hand in hand. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see on this map, the Rheingau is there in green, sort of in the middle. And it's a small but highly prestigious region. It produces some of the highest quality and age-worthy Rieslings. It stretches along the Rhine from Wiesbaden to Lorchhausen, and that takes in a little bit of the River Main around Hochheim. So if you see on the right-hand side there, you should see Hochheim, and then you've got the River Main coming into the Rhine as well. It's protected from the cold northerly winds by the western end of the Taunus Mountains, and the south-facing vineyard aspect means that the wines that are produced here are fuller bodied and they have riper fruit characteristics. The Rhine's about 1 kilometre wide here. I think we should have the next image will show you some of the mists that can come off of the Rhine. There we go, lovely. So the Rhine River helps to moderate the temperatures and it reduces a frost risk. It also increases the humidity, which is perfect for the botrytis quality in autumn if you were in the Rheingau and you're making a botrytized Riesling. The focus is very much on quality. The yields generally tend to be lower than the rest of Germany. I think the next image that we have should show you the lovely steep vineyards. It will also show you them in the snow, which I just think is a beautiful contrasting image. But you can see really quite clearly how wide the Rhine actually is. The soils range from sort of a sand and loamy soil in the east of the Rheingau to a more sort of sandstone slate further west. And the plantings are around 85% dominated by white varieties, with Riesling being the dominant white in that group. The majority are dry, but as we said, there will also be some sweet wines produced as well, some very high quality sweet wines. Now the image, if we could just go back to the first image of the mist, let's just go back, lovely. You should be able to see the remains of a castle. Now that's something that's quite interesting about the Rheingau. It used to be the home of the German aristocracy, and so Schloss, which means castle or manor house, is found quite often in many winery names because there are a lot of them around. So if you see a wine that's got Schloss in the winery, you have a strong inclination that it's likely from the Rheingau. It is mainly estate production, so that is single estate production, with the co-ops being a little bit less influential here. So that is a little Riesling and Rheingau. So we will be coming back to Riesling a little bit later on with Anna and sweetness. But I think if we want to move along in Germany a little bit, Anna.
Yeah, lovely. I thought I'd just say how much I enjoyed the dry Riesling that I've got. Members, if anyone else has, like me, got the Vom Loss, I thought it was absolutely delicious, super fresh. Could have done with it maybe at 2 o'clock this afternoon when it was so sunny outside.
Yeah,
um,
I agree. I think the Rieslings from Rheingau are very fresh, and they've got a really nice sort of light orchard fruit. I think it's more that sort of like apricot and maybe a little bit of a white peach rather than a real sort of sweet concentrated fruit. But yeah, do let us know in the chat what you're thinking.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, we'll move on to the next wine. So for members who are drinking along, as it were, we are going on to the Weissburgunder next, made by Belcher. So if anyone has this wine, do feel free to sip as I taste. I'm hoping that the wine will make everything that I'm saying come to life. But yes, let's do exactly as Catherine did. And I think let's start with the grape variety. As she mentioned, each of the wines were picked expertly by Catherine so that we could cover grape and place, and we cover a huge amount actually in this session. So yes, the Weissburgunder. It's actually a very ancient variety. And for those of you who have any knowledge of German, Weiss meaning white, and Burgunder is the grape variety family. So if you were a detective, you might have worked out that it's actually Pinot Blanc, or it's the same variety, just that is its French name. It is originally from France, so it's actually a Burgundian grape variety, hence Burgunder as well. And Pinot Blanc, or Weissburgunder, I should say, tends to grow in a range of soils. So right from really fertile to chalky. A good thing about this variety is that it ripens relatively late, but what it means is you can harvest it earlier than Riesling. So Riesling needs much longer to ripen to get its full richness, and particularly when you go to the quality level wines. But producers can grow Weissburgunder and then they can harvest it a bit earlier and get all of those grapes in before they move on to Riesling. Interestingly, it's later than Mosel Riesling, so if you have the full selection, you can time it perfectly, fingers crossed, and get lots of grapes in on the harvest. The really good thing about Weissburgunder is that it thrives in warmer climates where it would be too hot to grow that kind of very high acid, racy Riesling style. So this is really great for where this particular wine comes from, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. In terms of flavour, if you are tasting along, or if you're keen to know, or perhaps you're already a fan of Pinot Blanc, they tend to have less, and this isn't a negative thing, less pronounced bouquet, so less pronounced aromas. Now, you can say the same about Chardonnay, and Chardonnay is equally one of the greatest wines in the world, but it just means it's less aromatic than the other wines that we're going to be drinking today. So if you're getting less on the nose, that's absolutely fine. What you should get, though, is a lovely mouthfeel with Weissburgunder. It's got a little bit more acidity than Grauburgunder that we're going on to later, or it normally does, but it's got this kind of roundness and richness. So it's very much a textural wine more than something that you necessarily get on the nose. But the things you might smell, I think I've had a few people, I think I spotted somebody a moment ago say some really good things, but effectively you're thinking about things like citrus fruits, pears, things like that. Because we are a bit further south, you might have got some peachy flavors as well where it's warmed up. And I don't mean it's warmed up the wine, I mean that it's a little bit warmer down where this particular wine is grown. The plantings of Weissburgunder used to be minuscule. So in the 70s, less than 1% was planted to Weissburgunder across Germany. It was really not a particularly popular grape variety, but producers are realizing now that actually you can see really good quality if you treat this wine well. I should say Weissburgunder treated badly can be quite bland. If you treat it properly, it's absolutely delicious. So it's up to about 5.5% now and still rising. Predominant places it's planted are Baden, I'm about to talk about, and also the Rheinhessen and Pfalz. And you'll notice those are not necessarily further south, but they're certainly slightly warmer than some of the other regions. And in terms of the level of ripeness you want to get, I will go on to this at the end, so don't worry too much, but Spätlestrocken, which means later harvest, not late harvest sweet, but later picked. And I mentioned it could be picked later than Müller Thurgau. Later picked, but trocken dry is generally the style that they go for. So you're not really to expect any Weissburgunder that's sweet. It doesn't lend itself well to those styles. So you're pretty much guaranteed to get mainly trocken or dry wines. We'll have a little German dictionary as we go along, won't we, Catherine? But here we are. Here's the region. So it's so long, this region of Baden. It's that orange strip that you can see pretty much down the vast majority of your page. There's actually also a tiny little extra bit as well as you go towards Lake Constance. So you can see some other little yellow bits towards the lake. Unlike the region I'm going to talk about at the end, which is Mosel, this is more designated by politics than it is necessarily by terroir. So it's really important that if you do like certain Baden wines, that you actually look into where exactly they're from, because there is a patchwork of soils here and different growing conditions. It's actually 400 kilometers from north to south. It's the only, this is a bit techie, but I think it's worth saying, it's the only zone B of the growing regions. And what that means is the EU is split into heat designations. So it's not actually just heat, it's about sunshine hours and all of this sort of stuff. But if you imagine it literally a scale of warmer growing areas to cooler, almost all of Germany, other than Baden, is in the zone A, so the coolest zone. And this is the only one in zone B. Technically, that means there's some things legally they're not allowed to do. So they're not allowed to manipulate the wines in some of the ways that the more northerly areas are. But what it also means is we have a little bit extra warmth, and it means it's great for these Burgunder varieties. In fact, it's also probably the best place for red wine in Germany. And I know we're not talking about red wines today, but for those who do like Pinot Noir, this is where you get the top-notch Spätburgunder. You may recognize that beginning of the word, Spät. Spät translates as early. So it's the early harvest of the Burgunder grape. That is because there is a different clone of or warped version of Pinot Noir, which they don't really grow in France. It does have a French name. It's Pinot Noir Céleste, or excuse my French pronunciation. Sorry, yes, Spät is late, not early. Stupid me. Früh is early. So Früh Burgunder is the early ripening version, and this is Spätburgunder. That does not mean it's picked late. It's just that Pinot Noir, which is the grape variety of Spätburgunder, comes into its own a little bit later. So Spätburgunder makes up 50% of the plantings here. As I mentioned, Pinot Noir. Then we have Pinot Processi, which is the other red variety, less common. And then we have Grauburgunder and Weissburgunder that Catherine and I are talking about, and the local Badisch Rotgold, which is a rosé coloured speciality that they do here, which is a mix of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, so Grauburgunder and Spätburgunder. Soils, like I mentioned, are completely mixtured. So you've got some limestone soils up in the Tuberfranken. We've also got, interestingly, this particular wine is from the Kirchestuhl. And the Kirchestuhl is an extinct volcano area. So mainly sort of very, very old volcano or ex-volcanic rock, but then actually some loess soils have developed on top, which is like a free-flowing sand that's just blown in the wind, in some cases up to 35 meters. So very, very interesting soils. There's glacial deposits. There really is everything across Baden. So as I mentioned, if you find a wine from Baden that you like, it is important to do a bit of digging, not literally, that wasn't supposed to be a joke, but work out where exactly it's from, because the soils may well have affected, you know, the terroir of that region is very specific. Generally, there is more white wine made. And yes, I think that's probably all I'll tell you about Baden. It's a huge region, lots of variation, but generally top quality for red wines. However, the Burgunder family, Baden and Burgunder, match made in heaven. So anything with Burgunder on the end does really, really well in this part of Germany. So tiny bit more about the producer, and I won't go on for too long, but it is that volcanic area. So really interesting soil types. This particular producer, Bercher, about 600 years old, and we're now on the 9th and 10th generation of family making this wine. They have a really interesting portfolio. So they go from everything from Chenin Blanc to really local varieties, and they even have an orchard where they grow their own fruit to make eau de vie. So they're a really eclectic bunch. We love the Bercher wines at the Wine Society. I think they're a great mixture, but this in particular for me, it's one of my house wines. I think it's a really nice, crowd-pleasing, easy drinking, great value wine as well. I think probably if I was going to liken it to anything, I would actually go towards Chenin and Chardonnay. But obviously, if you know Pinot Blanc from places like the Alsace, etc., then it's that's what it is, Pinot Blanc.
Lovely. Thank you.
How did you find it, Catherine?
Very refreshing. Yeah, it was very, I can imagine that would be, I wish I had some food actually with it. I think it's definitely a very good food wine for the flavors in that bit. It's not, like you said, there's not too much happening on the nose, but then on the palate it's very nice and crisp and a little bit more, I think someone said a little bit more acid than an Alsace Pinot Blanc, and I would agree, but I imagine that would go down very nicely with the food. I think that's something as well to say, that German wines are very much known for their compatibility with food. So that's also something to keep an eye out for when you're drinking your wines this evening. Have a think of what you might like to eat with them. So shall we go on to the other in the Pinot family that we're looking at today? So that is the Pinot Gris. So the Pinot Gris, or known as Grauburgunder in Germany, it is synonymous with Pinot Gris in France or Pinot Grigio in Italy. And it's a variety that needs quite good vineyards with deep, heavy soil. The harvest time is usually around late September and early October. And as Anna said, it's very much grown primarily in Baden and also in Pfalz, which I'll be moving on to in a moment. It's got a little bit more going on for it as a Grauburgunder from Germany than perhaps a Pinot Grigio would. It's a bit more of the orchard fruit. There can be a bit of a flinty flavour to it, and also some spice, perhaps some ginger in there. And perhaps that's not a fair assumption to make against Italian Pinot Grigio. Perhaps it depends on the Pinot Grigio that you are buying. But I often find that Italian Pinot Grigio often has more of a lighter touch about it, whereas hopefully with the Grauburgunder you'll find that there is a little bit more in the flavour and the characters going on. Hopefully we've got a picture of the grapes there for you, so you'll be able to see that although it makes a white wine, it is a red-skinned variety. The skin is a sort of pinky grey blue hue, which is perhaps not what you would expect for a white variety. You can see that the skin is fairly thin. It's pretty translucent, where you can see the light coming through there. But you might find as well, I definitely have it a little bit with the Grauburgunder that we've got now, is that you have an ever so slight pink tinge to the wine. So it can be that it's only if you see it in a certain light, or if you do a little bit of a double take as to whether you can see any sort of rosy glow to it or not. But you will often find that these wines do have a little bit more in the colour. So it is a lovely wine. Like I say, if you're familiar with Pinot Grigio, this is a good one to consider. A German Pinot Gris or a Grauburgunder is something good to consider if you're wanting something with a little bit more oomph. I think it's a bit more of a interesting wine personally to an Italian Pinot Grigio. The one that we've got is the Ruppertsberger Lindenbusch Grauburgunder. Let me try and get that for you there. And this is from the Ruppertsberg Cooperative, which is brilliantly managed by winemaker Gerard Brewer. And we buy a lot of his wines, and it's a very good cooperative. They really focus on the quality of the grapes to produce the wines. They're very consistent with their quality. Now, as I say, this is from Pfalz. Pfalz is one of the main regions that Grauburgunder is from. And Pfalz is a narrow strip of vineyards between the Hert Mountains on the west and the Rhine Plain on the east. Unusually for vineyard region in Germany, it's not centered along a river valley. So you'll be able to see on the map here, it's very much a bit of space away from the river. It's one of the driest regions in Germany, and there is a bit of a drought risk on occasion. So the Hert Mountains are actually a continuation of the Alsace-Vosges Mountains, and they give a similar rain shadow effect, which contributes to the dryness. Again, here the whites dominate, with around 66% of the plantings being white varieties. Riesling, obviously, being king of the white grapes in Germany. And then around a quarter is Müller-Thurgau. Riesling is around a quarter, and then you've got Müller-Thurgau, Grauburgunder and Weissburgunder bringing up the rest of the white plantings. The warmer temperatures mean that the wines are fuller bodied with a lot more ripe fruit concentration. And again, there's a mix of soils here. You've got limestone, sandstone, basalt, which again is the volcanic type of soil, and some clay soils. In South Pfalz, there's very fertile sandstone soils, and that used to be mainly inexpensive wine production made there. But recently there has been an increase in winemakers focusing on that region to make quality wines, particularly Grauburgunder and Weissburgunder. Now, like Alsace, Southern Pfalz has had French and German rule. It's flip-flopped between the two, which is one of the reasons that Pinot varieties are still very common in the area, along with the influence of the climate and the growing conditions that do make them a really good place to grow those Pinot varieties. Here, the higher volume production is mainly dominated by merchant houses, and then the higher quality comes from smaller estates or very much quality focused co-ops like the Ruppertsberger that we've got the Grauburgunder from this evening. You can see there's lots of lovely comments going on in the chat. Anna, what are you thinking of the Grauburgunder?
I actually think this is my favourite so far, Catherine. Now, I saw a comment earlier about from Richard Tilbrook. Does the cooperative intend it to be slightly fizzy? I guess talking about pétillants. Now, I personally didn't get any, but it can be sort of bottle specific pétillants. But what I do get is acidity that's so unexpectedly high for me. I really wasn't expecting that kind of, it's almost tongue tickly, tongue prickly. And I think sometimes Grauburgunder, really well made, and likewise sort of Northern Italian Pinot Gris can do that to me. I get almost a white pepper feeling in my mouth.
Yeah, I agree. You get that white pepper, slight powdered ginger. I always find that real sort of not quite fiery, but definite warmth there. I did have a little bit of a spritz on opening mine, but a bit of swirling did get that to go. So it can be something. It's worth noting as well that these are screw top bottles, so there can be a little bit of extra spritz there with the carbonation in terms of preservation. I have just seen a comment which I will just address now from Alan Pierce, because we've mentioned Müller-Thurgau. We've both mentioned it throughout this, and he's asking where else is it used. Don't see it much. Is it used in the UK? Now, it is. Quite a lot of English wines use German varieties. So you may be more familiar with indigenous German varieties like Müller-Thurgau, like Bacchus in your English wines than perhaps you are having as single varietals. But
although I should say, Catherine, Müller-Thurgau's indigenous might be a strong use of the word, right? Because Müller-Thurgau is a crossing.
It is.
So yes, crossed. By Dr. Hermann Müller in the 1880s by crossing Madeleine Royale and Riesling to try and produce a wine with high acidity, but that could, grow better. I think the interesting thing about that for me is Müller-Thurgau in the UK, Catherine. I don't know whether you agree, but really good stuff.
Yeah. I would definitely say to search out a Mosel Riesling if you've not had it before.
And there's a little bit grown in Austria as well if you want to explore, but generally it deals very, very well in cool climates. So it's not a variety that would ripen well in, you know, more southerly temperatures. Going back to those gradings earlier, it's going to be A and B climatic zones. You don't want to go much warmer than that, otherwise you're going to get cooked Mosel Riesling. So, but yes. We've had a few, yes, Peter, there's a few people saying that they enjoyed it. I think Stephen said that he enjoyed it as well, and he's perhaps not a German wine drinker. So my wine of the night so far, Catherine.
Oh, I think it is mine too, but we've got a sweetie to go, so that might sway me.
So don't speak too soon. Lovely. In which case, I am going to move on to the final wine, or wines plural, I should say, actually, shouldn't I? But certainly the final region. So for anybody who is tasting along, it will be the sweet Riesling. And I'll talk about sweetness after I talk about the area of production of this wine. But just so you know, I am drinking the Zilliken, so the 2019 Cabernet. And I won't talk about Riesling. Catherine did a fantastic job. Instead, I'm going to talk about the Mosel, and then I'm going to talk about sweetness in German wines. So the Mosel is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, wine growing area in Germany. There are wine presses found here from Roman times, so definitely evidence of wine production dating that far back. And I mentioned when I was talking about Baden that it's more of a political boundary than it is a terroir boundary. Mosel is definitely a terroir boundary. So along the Mosel River, you'll find lots of similarities. I think in some ways that's what has made it as popular, amongst other things that I'll get into. But it has made it popular because Mosel wines can be not necessarily uniform in a bad way, but much easier to understand because you know what you're going to get with the Mosel wines. So you can see it follows a tributary of a river, but this is not a river that flows a particularly easy course. It changes direction so often that I think it doubles the distance of the crow flying, as in the length of the river does. It moves northeast into the Rhine. And if we just go back to the map for a moment, sorry, just to give you a, because I call it the Mosel, but you can see there's two tributaries down at the bottom as well. And those are included. So those tributaries are in, yeah, there we go. We've got a nice cursor on them. So we do include those tributaries as well. But again, it's terroir driven. So we really know what we're getting with these here. It's the Saar and the Ruhr rivers. So there's 8,000 hectares grown here. That is about half of the Baden wine I was talking about earlier, just over half. But the conditions here are so difficult. It's really, really hard to grow wine here, or not to grow it necessarily, but to harvest it. So we had a picture earlier of the sort of bend of the bend of the river. In that middle section, that looks relatively easy. But if you move on to, yes, exactly, those higher bits of land, they are extremely steep. Most, half of the vineyards are grown at 30 degrees incline, but some are planted up to 70-degree gradient. So we're talking, you know, Northern Rhone territory, proper backbreaking stuff. So what that means for grape growing is that every vine needs to have, at 70 degrees, will have a wooden stake in the ground, an 8-foot wooden stake. And if you imagine, the other thing about the Mosel is that the soils are made of slate, so they're really slippy. So you're having to walk up and down these 70-degree inclines with a soil type that lends itself to slipping, and not just slipping, but also for the vines, you know, movement of the soils. So it can be incredibly tricky you can lose rows and rows of vines just from what is effectively landsliding. Obviously, everything has to be picked by hand. You can't get machines up a 70-degree incline. So it's hugely labor intensive, and it's a massive labor of love, I think, is the best way to describe the Mosel. But thank goodness that we do it, because I think Sebastian Payne MW is, a buyer for the Wine Society, is quoted as saying that these are the best low alcohol wines in the world. And interestingly, now that there is a trend towards lower alcohol, I think where we've sort of maybe neglected the quality of the Mosel in the UK, or maybe, you know, not demanded as much of our importers to get these kinds of wines in, I see a real opportunity for the Mosel to come and blow the world away with these wines. If you're on the call tonight, chances are you already know how beautiful they are, but it's probably time the rest of the world did as well. The region is divided into 6 areas. I won't go into them, and as I mentioned, it's a little bit more uniform than some of the other more politically or legally driven zoning. But the 2 things that are main things to remember about the Mosel, I've already mentioned one of them, and that's slate. And the second thing is Riesling. And that is because Riesling is really the king here. So there are other varieties grown, but they are grown in much smaller quantities. Riesling absolutely dominates in the Mosel. The other varieties, if you want them, are Rivanna, which is what they call Rheingau here. That's the second most. And then there's a very, very old grape variety called Elbling, which I've never even tried, but really it's Riesling. And there's a reason that it's king here. It's absolutely beautiful. It's in a nice protected valley, so it's a relatively warm climate as well, even though it's not as southerly as some of the other climates. But it does mean that you get this depth of flavour and this intensity. So even the dry wines of the Mosel have this richness and this strength of flavour. But what it's really known for and world renowned for are these brilliant, brilliant sweet wines. And we're not talking all of them being dessert. Some of them are sort of mid-sweet and much lighter in style. So yes, but Riesling is really king here. And I think probably it's the most, if you think of German wine, a Mosel sweet Riesling would be where most people go to, unless they're going to a very misaligned, misguided Blue Nun or something. If you know your quality wines of Germany, then a Mosel sweet Riesling is pretty much as good as it gets. So I will tell you about my wine first, which is the Saarburger Rausch Cabinet, 2019. So it's a relatively small producer. There's 10 hectares of Riesling that they grow. I'm going to go on to the sweetness levels in a second. So, but just to say that Cabinet is the band with the least sugars in the grape when you harvest them, not necessarily sweetness, but the least sugars in the grape when you harvest them. What that also tends to mean is those are the ones that are either picked early or perhaps not in as much of a sun trap or a cooler climate. So for a Cabinet wine like this, even though it's sweet, you're still going to expect things like lemon and lime, and then a tiny bit of nectarine and peach, but you're not going into those kind of bigger, fuller sweet wine flavors necessarily. To give you the stats on this wine, it is 8.5% alcohol. Just confirm that, because I did read that earlier. Yeah, 8.5% alcohol. So I'll tell you a bit more about that shortly. 60 grams of residual sugar, 60. And the acidity is 7.4 grams. And the wine stopped fermenting on its own accord. So when it reached that 60 grams per litre of sugar, the yeast in the fermentation simply stopped working. And that's why you're left with a balance of lower alcohol and higher sugar. That will all become clear very shortly. But I'll quickly now talk about the Braunberger Sonne Nur, which is a Riesling Spätlese from von Kettelstadt. That's a 2017 vintage. I don't have it. I'm gutted. I'd be in trouble if I started ordering all the wines on a tasting, but if you've got it, please let me know what you think. That producer only makes Riesling. That is all they focus on. And they have 36 hectares. Again, old family. They date back to 1300s. So long history of wine growing there. And this wine has a lower alcohol content, so 7.5%, and the residual sugar is higher, so nearly 80 grams per litre, 79.9. The acid is also higher, 9.7. Now, I'm going to talk about sweetness now, but those two pieces of information I gave you, and I'm not going to go too numerical, but those numbers I gave you are a really, really big indication on how you can help yourself judge sweetness in German wines. If you imagine sugar and alcohol like a weighing scale, during fermentation, when the yeast is eating the sugar, it converts it to alcohol. If there is more sugar in those grapes and the fermentation has to stop, it will not have converted it to alcohol. And that fundamentally is how the Prädikatswein and Qualitätswein system works in Germany. So it's tricky, and we will go through it really briefly, but it's just unfortunately something you have to learn. So the German law is kind of dictated by this must level. So wine law classifies that the quality of a wine is based on the sugar in the must, in the grape juice. So how much sugar has come in that grape juice? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be sugar in the wine. So you can still get really top quality wines that don't necessarily have lots of sugar in, because that process has happened fully. It's fully converted all of the alcohol. So what you've got here, and I can only apologize for the small writing, but Wines of Germany have got this great diagram, and I will send it round. So 44 to 50% would be a Deutsche Wein, like a table wine. A Spätlese, 80 to 95%. I'm just, sorry, not 95%, 95 in the Urschel scale. And I'm just moving up. You don't have to learn these, don't worry, but it just goes to show you that they gradually get up and up and up and up and up. But there are 6 that you need to learn. And we had a great member come on the other day who was talking to us about these, the Prädikatswein levels. And Tim, if you don't mind just going on to the next slide, apologies. But basically you start with, it should be an interesting little diagram of some grapes. There we go. So we have, let's ignore the stuff in the blue and the white on this grape diagram. And again, sorry if you can't fully read it, but I'm going to read it out anyway. To the member who said my German is a 7 or an 8 out of 10, I should say I was born in and raised in Baden, but Baden, Switzerland, not Baden, Germany. So apologies for my pronunciation. But effectively, what you start with at the top of the tree, you may have heard this before, is cabinet. Cabinet literally translates as cabinet wine, and that can be anything from dry to sweet. But you must remember that it started with the lowest sugar in its must. You then have Spätlese, which means later harvest. Or later picking. Doesn't mean late picked sweet wine like we think of here in the UK. It just means that you've waited a little bit longer to pick those grapes. They have more natural sugar in them when they come into the winery. But again, we can go from dry through to sweet. Those wines have a potential alcohol of about 10%. So you can see we're not getting up to the big boys yet in sweetness, because that balance weighing scale is going to drop any second now. We then have Urschlese. That's the next up. And again, that means selective picking. So that has a potential alcohol of about 12%, but it still can have sweet wines. And then we move into the proper sweet wines. The following 3 categories cannot be dry, i.e. they all have to have sweetness in them. And they are Beerenauslese, Trockenbeerenauslese, and Eiswein. Beerenauslese literally means berries, so selected berries. And for anyone who likes Sauterne or other botrytized wines, those berries have been picked because they've started to botrytize. We then have Trockenbeerenauslese. Trocken means dry. So confusing, because Trocken, when you see it on a label, such as the Bircher wine we had, the Weissburgunder said Trocken, that means the wine is dry, i.e. no sugar. Trockenbeerenauslese is a compound word. So they've added dry at the beginning, and that means dried selected berries. So that does not mean your wine is dry. So don't fall into the trocken trap. What that means is that the berries have been raisined. They're so dry. And then lastly, ice fine, which I'm sure some of you might be familiar with. And ice fine is effectively a wine made from grapes that have been frozen, and then therefore the ice particles essentially move to the top. And once, we got it down there. The ice fine, the water moves to the top, providing the frozen water, moves to the top, providing concentration of sugar and flavors that are left once you press. So that was really a whistle-stop tour. I'll send you around this diagram. It effectively shows that some of the categories can go across all dry, off dry, and fruity, they call it. But likewise, it shows you that only 3 of the categories, those 3 coming out the bottom, have to be sweet. So how do we get our heads around it? How do we know when we're in a supermarket or when we're on the Wine Society website that what we're picking up is dry or sweet? Dark magic, no, I'm joking. It's actually a relatively easy trick. And that is purely looking at the alcohol. Those weighing scales I mentioned at the beginning are the key. 7% to 8.5, you're going to have a fruity wine. It's going to be sweet. 9 to 10.5, 11, probably off dry. Once you start going 12 and above, you've got a dry wine. So the top tips are, don't be tricked by Trocken. If it says Trocken beer and Auslese on, you've got a wine that's possibly sweeter than Sauterne. So don't always be tricked by Trocken. Don't buy necessarily by the label, buy by the alcohol content if you're trying to buy by sweetness. And then lastly, I would say that don't be scared of sweetness. A little bit of sweetness in Riesling is really actually quite important. Sometimes the acidity is so high that having a bit of residual sugar and a bit of sweetness in the wine, your chances are you might not even detect the sweetness, because actually what's happened is that the wine's in balance. So yes, those are my top tips. And we could have done a whole hour on sweetness in German wine. So it was really cool to ask me to do that, Catherine. Especially cool with all my pronunciation faux pas.
Well, I will now do some pronunciation of my own. We'll give you some slightly, let's hope it's good pronunciation. I have been practicing, so a little bit more on some labelling tips of what to look for. So we've done sweetness. So luckily Anna took that one. Thank you very much, Anna, for doing that. So I won't go into that again. But some other things to take a note of in terms of what to look out for on your German wines and to know how to select them. So there are 13 delimited regions, PDO regions in Germany, that they're protected designation of origin, and they're not linked to varieties like the French appellation system. There's also the PGIs, which are the protected geographical indication, and they are made and usually labelled as Landwein. So the PDO wines will come from only the one region, and the region is stated on the label. Unlike the French, the Germans do like to make it quite clear for us. So let me just hold this one up for you. So as you will see, there we go, down at the bottom, we've got Rheingau. So it gives you a good bit of information as to where the wine is from. The PDO wines only come from the one region. As I said, it's on the label. Often, varietal labelling is quite common as well. Now, having a quick look at these bottles, this one actually unfortunately doesn't say Riesling. So it's not a hard and fast rule that they will all say it, but it is, no, that's a lie. I can't see the label for the words. There we go. We've got Riesling on the back. So quite often the variety is on there. For example, on the Grauburgunder as well, we've got it there. You'll see that there's a slightly different spelling. It can either be Grauburgunder like this, or Grau and then Burgunder as all one word. but often the variety is also on there. Another thing to take note of is the vineyard location is often commonly stated as well, and it will include the name of the village and then the name of the vineyard that they have chosen. So they do like to give a lot of information. Now, I've seen in the chat there's a few bits of conversation about VDP, and we've had some questions on VDP as well. So I will go on to that now. Now, I'm going to apologise in advance for my pronunciation. These are some very long words, so hopefully they will be nice and clear for you. But Germany doesn't have a legally defined term for quality in the same way that Grand Cru and Premier Cru in France are legally defined. However, what it does have is the Verbund Deutscher Prädikatsweingüter, which is VDP. And this is a group of producers that came together to classify their own vineyards by consensus. And it does include the vast majority of Germany's best sites. The classification is seen in a few different ways. So I'm going to do a little bit of a readout now because it's unfortunately not something that I can retain and pronounce. So you've got VDP Gutswein, which are regional wines quite similar to generic or regional wines in Burgundy. They have to meet general standards prescribed by the VDP, and the maximum permitted yield is 75 hectolitres per hectare. You've also then got the VDP Ortswein, which is the equivalent of village wines in Burgundy, again produced from grape varieties that are typical of their region. Their maximum yield is also 75 hectolitres per hectare. You've got VDP Erstlage, which is the sort of first class, so sort of Premier Cru of Germany. These must be hand harvested. They must be at least ripe enough to qualify for Spätlese status, and their yield, the maximum yield, is lower. It's only 60 hectolitres per hectare. And then you've got the VDP Grosslage, which is the equivalent to Grand Cru, so it's the very best parcels. Theirs is even lower at 50 hectolitres per hectare. Now, dry wines made from grapes from the Grosslage designation are the Grosses Gewachs, and the term Grosses Gewachs cannot appear on the label. Instead, it will have VDP GG, and only the vineyard name appears on the label and not the village, which again is similar to Grand Cru in Burgundy. Now, the only other additional sort of classification is the Rheingau Charta, which was introduced in 1984 to promote the best dry wines from the best vineyard sites in the Rheingau. The term Erstes Gewachs was introduced for the best sites in Rheingau, and that is now a legally protected term for wines from these sites. They must be produced exclusively from Riesling or Spätburgunder. They must be hand harvested from lower yielding vineyards, and the wines must be dry with a minimum must weight equivalent to Spätlese. In 1999, the members of the Charta joined the VDP in Rheingau, and those members who previously used Erstes Gewachs can now label the wines as Grosses Gewachs as the GG. But while the Rheingau Charta is legally recognised for quality, the VDP isn't, but it is it's recognised within the winemaking community, even though it is something that they kind of assess between themselves. It's done quite honestly and openly, so it's not something that you, just because it's not in the wine law, doesn't mean it's something to ignore. So if you see a VDP wine, you know you're in good hands with it, as some of these ones are.
VDP is someone said it's a club, not a bad thing.
It is a club, yeah, but it's a club that have the best interests for each other in the club. So it's yeah, it's definitely a good thing. And perhaps, who knows, perhaps it will become like the Rheingau Charta has, perhaps eventually it will come into law.
And I think, interestingly, some of the areas in VDP are better at promoting more forward-thinking. So, for example, the Mosel's not the wines that are in the VDP and the Mosel tend to be a bit more traditional, which may, not be the same as Rheinhessen, for example, which have a little bit more. The guys from Rheinhessen in the VDP are a bit more liberal. So there's definitely some variation, but I think I couldn't agree more, Catherine. A wine group that have everyone's interests at heart and that are tasted, because
Yes.
that's the key.
Yes.
The panel tasting and making sure that it has to be judged by your peers blind is pretty unique, actually. I can't think of another big movement like it. We've had somebody mention similar thing going on in Rioja.
Yeah.
I think VDP is about 100 years old now, so
it is. I think it was 1901. So yeah, it's been around a long. It's an institution in itself. So definitely good to go on. And Julia said that it's maybe complicated, but the wines are worth the effort, and producer is key. I absolutely agree, Julia. And Alan, I'm afraid I can't repeat it all again.
Catherine, you
enough gumption to just get through it the first time.
Fantastic. So, Catherine, I think we've got a few questions that have already been answered actually in our Q&A, but we have had quite a few people talk about pairings. So I think at the very least, should we cover off some pairings and our favorite pairings?
Absolutely, yes, let's.
So do you want to start maybe with your Riesling, perhaps your dry Riesling? Is there anything in particular you'd pair with that?
So I would go not particularly German, but something like dim sum. I would think would go really nicely with that dry Riesling. It's got a real nice crisp sort of appley, orchardy fruit, but something that's dim sum tends to, or the ones I eat anyway, tends to have that nice sort of fatty element to it. So it's nice to have something that is nice and refreshing to cut through as well. I think it's definitely a wine that for me, it's something you would want something on the other scale. So again, maybe something like some roast pork as well, something that's got, a nice counterbalance of texture and flavor to go with it. So they work in harmony rather than being too much of one thing. But,
we had a member earlier, I think from memory as well, asked which cheese, and for me it's the softies, so bries, camemberts, those sorts of things go well with dry Riesling, because you basically want to cut through fatty things, that high acid dry taste.
Yeah, absolutely.
You nicked my idea for my Weissburgunder because I was going to say roast pork. So that was kind of you, Catherine.
You haven't again. Heavily, I feel.
Yeah, well, Riesling's got that lovely appley flavour, and Weissburgunder similar actually. So yeah, I would go roast pork. I think with Weissburgunder you can maybe go a bit richer in terms of the really light lemony styles. You could even go for a fish pie, if you really wanted to. But for me, yeah, cutting through the fat of a roast pork is exceptional.
I agree.
And the Grauburgunder, Catherine?
So I was going to go pork again, but something like, well, I mean, one thing, definitely German cuisine. So something like a schnitzel would be great to have with that. I think that this one, because it has that nice bit of spice to it as well. It's got that nice sort of white pepper, gingery note. Definitely something that is a little bit in that flavor profile. So even perhaps something a bit more on the lighter sort of, I'm going to say curry, but I don't mean like a really hot curry, something that's perhaps got a lot of like ginger and lemongrass and maybe like a coconut milk base. So then you've got the richness and the texture, that the acidity of the Grauburgunder can cut through, but you've got that really nice play off of maybe something like a light sort of butternut squash curry with some really nice aromatic flavors in there, some lemongrass, ginger. I think something like that would be really nice.
I think I agree. And I would also say both of the Burgunder wines for me, just because of that extra richness as well, might go with things like quiches, which is more of that classic Alsatian pairing.
Yeah. So if you're thinking of any picnics, now that we're allowed to sit on benches with someone else, and it be allowed, then definitely that with perhaps I don't know, like a quiche Lorraine or an sweet onion tart or something.
Scotch egg with your Grauburgunder.
Amazing.
That's what we want to be doing, Catherine. And then to finish it all off, you could have the sweet Rieslings with some nice fruity salad.
Yeah.
I have to say though, one thing I didn't really mention when we were talking sweet wines is that generally the German trend is definitely towards dry. So interestingly, the sweet wine trend is losing itself perhaps a little bit, but generally in places like the Mosel, where it's cold and the acidity is so high, we'll never lose the sweet wines of the Mosel, because actually they make sweet Riesling better than they do dry Riesling there. So we can still look after these wines. But for me, these are good as an aperitif as well. So you can go for the traditional sort of pre-dinner spritz up with a bit of acid, a bit of sugar, and get everyone in the mood for a party. So I would actually be inclined, when we're not talking Trockenbeer and Auslese, and we're not talking ice wine, and we're not talking what the Brits would call pudding wines, but which really are kind of sugar wines at 150 grams per litre sugar, when we're talking about that 60-70 area, I'd be inclined not to have it with sweet food, and to have it as an apero, as a little a wine by itself, really.
Absolutely.
Flammkuchen, yes, absolutely. Anything with cream, cheese, bacon, all of those flavors.
Yes,
that's really what you want.
Decadent. Absolutely.
That's why Riesling's the beautiful grape that it is, though, because it can cut through all of that, and you're going to feel refreshed even if you have an enormous tartiflette.
Yeah. Oh, that would be a dream. Oh, I wish I had that for dinner now. I will just
potato is not quite the same, is it?
I would just say, because I've noticed a few people in the chat have been asking as well about the availability of the mixed case that I referred to. It may be slightly tricky to find on our website because it's now under a slightly new iteration. We're now onto a sub case because it's been very popular, but it is on there as the Germany mixed case. We can pop a link in the chat for you now, but it is on there and it is in stock. So if you would like to increase your German wine repertoire, do give it a go. We'll have a look. I mean, I think Germany is, I think we can safely say, Anna, that perhaps even at the Wine Society, we've not necessarily given it its dues in recent years. That's not for the lack of Marcel, our buyer, not for lack of him being a big German wine fan, but I think in terms of finding the wines that are of the quality that we want to give our members, and also that have the availability. I think someone mentioned that a lot of the good wines from Germany seem to be kept on the home market. And again, that is something that we do have to consider. We also have to consider, if we're getting a wine on our list, we want to have enough of it for people to be able to benefit. But it is something definitely that I think we are looking at improving. And I think from the comments, it seems that a lot of people are looking forward to trying some new German wines, going back to some old favorites. And yeah, it's definitely opened my eyes again to go into something that I wouldn't necessarily automatically choose, but I think now I will.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think in the run up to summer, Catherine, I actually can't think of a better country to buy wine from.
No, absolutely.
It's a great easing us all into summer. Like you said, those final picnics we're allowed to have, friends in the garden. I can't think of a better way to celebrate them with some top quality German wines, actually. So
really,
I hope you all do the same.
Yes. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Wines of Germany, as well, for the images and the maps. If you don't even want to order the German wines or drink German wines, I think from those images, I don't know about anyone else, but I definitely want to go to Germany and just to see the scenery when we are able to get abroad again. And thank you, Anna, for joining me this evening. Pleasure as always.
Thank you, and cheers.